Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Thanks for all of you coming out this afternoon. I will leave plenty of time for Q&A, but it's always great to be here at Colonie Library. I see John Krupe, one of our former editors here. I'm sure it's no secret to her. We like to play hooky and come over here and lose ourselves in the stacks every now and then in the afternoon. And
can you hear okay?
Sometimes I get so many books and have so many books in my library at home and check so many out here. I've occasionally been known to have overdue books. And Joe has the secret get out of jail free one, so he's absolved me of a few overdue fines. Apparently,
don't tell too many people
that. But I like libraries. This is a great library. They've got a really good staff, and we can talk about anything, newspapers, anything you want to talk about. But the subject is the Albany Rural Cemetery today. How many of you have walked around the cemetery or been in the cemetery? Well, that's great. I was going to say we could end it right here and dispense with the talk and all go take a walk at the cemetery. It's really, this time of year is beautiful there. I see Michael Radlick, who's featured prominently in this book and knows more about the cemetery than I'll ever know. Part of the great fun and joy for me in this project was spending hour after hour with wonderful experts and local historians and people who know, all the interesting backstory and all the out-of-the-way places at the cemetery, and just spending hours there walking around the cemetery and absorbing their knowledge. Because I always say, as a reporter, as a writer, as a journalist, we are absorbing and drawing information from other people. I'm only as good as my sources. So my sources on this book are the people who know the cemetery the best, the historical research I did in interviews, but again, I don't know the cemetery probably as well as a lot of people in this room do. So this book was a project at the Albany Times-Union. It benefits our Hope Fund, and I'll give a little plug for the Hope Fund. That helps children, disadvantaged children, sends them to after-school programs and summer camp programs. We raise and distribute probably $75,000 to $80,000 a year. We have bake sales and other things at the Times-Union, a lot of fundraising events, and that's kind of our in-house charity. There's absolutely no overhead. Every penny, every dollar that goes directly to the programs for the children. So this book, I have some copies here for sale. I'll stick around afterwards if anyone wants to buy one and have it signed. All proceeds go to the Times-Union Hope Fund. So many of you know the Albany Rural Cemetery, which is great. One reason we wanted to do this project is because I believe, and we believe, and other people involved with the cemetery believe, it's really a kind of an overlooked, neglected gem. I'd say it's one of the great natural beauties and architectural wonders in the whole Capital Region. Norman Rice, who many of you know, and I regard him as one of the greatest, kind of a landmark and an icon of this region, one of the greatest historians and knowledgeable about Albany culture, says next to the State Library, it is the greatest cultural resource we have in this region, and I tend to agree with that. It's 467 acres. There are about 35 miles of pathways through it. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. And again, if you have some time on any time of the year, Michael and his wife run there every morning. I ran with them. I didn't actually run. I walked and took notes. They ran. They run every morning, in all seasons through the cemetery, and they've seen some amazing things. But the cemetery, if you really study the way cultures deal with their dead, it's really a reflection of the living. It's a reflection of the culture. And this cemetery, built in 1841, one of the largest, grandest, most important in what was called the rural cemetery movement in this country, was kind of a response to the neglect that we had taken in America for hundreds of years. prior to this being incorporated in 1841, in the early part of the 19th century, in the 18th century in Albany, people were buried kind of as an afterthought in small cemeteries in the heart of downtown Albany attached to churches. They had a little graveyard behind the church, and over decades and time, these became overcrowded. It became a public health concern. They would have to stack up sometimes 3 or 4 coffins when Albany always flooded before they built the Sacandaga Reservoir. And floods would come through, and there were accounts of coffins being opened and remains being strewn about downtown. And there were concerns about drinking water near these small, really unregulated, not very well done churchyard cemeteries. So eventually they moved all those small cemeteries to near Washington Park, near Willett and State Street. And there were several thousand, burials and remains and bodies placed there. And again, as the city kind of moved westward and expanded to the park and beyond from the downtown, from near the Hudson River, again, people got concerned. We have thousands of people buried near where we live, work, drink, etc. So those bodies were all removed and moved to the Albany Rural Cemetery in 1868. But again, this cemetery movement grew out of a desire to have more reverence, have a special place to bury the dead of this region, and also a place where families and people could spend an afternoon and, as it were, commune with the dead. It was a belief in the Victorian era that it was almost like a theme park or a park today. Today, you might go to Thatcher Park. In the 1890s, you would go to Albany Rural Cemetery. There were guided horse-drawn carriage tours. There were maps. There were postcards. Thousands of people came there every year to spend an afternoon, to spend a day, or to come several times a year to look at the monuments. That's the other thing about the cemetery. The monuments are spectacular. I mean, the best architects, artists, stone carvers in this region did their work there. So you'll see, incredible monuments, half as big as this room, ornately carved, took months and years to complete, and they're spread throughout the cemetery. There's also, 2 streams, dozens of varieties of trees. It's just a beautiful natural setting. But I'm really interested in the stories that it can tell about the history and the people of this region. So this book, we took 50 people, just kind of chosen for their historic value. There's one president buried there, for instance. Anyone know who that is? Chester Arthur, I'm sure. I won't get anything over on this group. So Chester Arthur, how many mayors do you think are buried there? I might have to cheat and double check my facts here. How many mayors? 55. Are you looking at the book? You're right. 55. How many members of the presidential cabinet? I have it here. I think there were about 8 or a dozen or so. I might have to cheat and get my glasses because this is small print. So anyway, just in terms of politics, there's a really rich and interesting group of people buried there. But I was also interested in a lot of the other stories, some of the inventors or some of the kind of tragic stories. And there's over 135,000 people buried there. So as I say, it makes it, the largest city in the capital region. It is a city of the dead, but again, the dead have a lot to tell us. So how many members of Congress do you think are buried there? Quiz. 34 members of Congress. And as we said, 55 mayors. There were 5 governors, 8 presidential cabinet members, and the 1 president. So I thought I would read a couple of these. Again, they're 50 short profiles of people who are interesting, who are buried there. And again, chosen for a wide variety of reasons. There's some really tragic stories. There's some stories of entrepreneurial greatness. There's stories of fortunes won and lost. There's stories of people who died young. You can also see through the cemetery all all the different diseases that came through, scarlet fever, yellow fever. You look through the period of the Civil War, and it's amazing. There's been at least 1,030 Civil War soldiers and sailors identified who are buried there. And you go through some of the markers and see how short lifespans were in the 19th century. And you see a lot that way that, life was not as easy as we have it today, and a lot of things could end your lives in a short order. But this is a story about Kate Hamilton, Catherine Kate Hamilton, and I'll read it. Catherine Kate Hamilton and the uncertainty surrounding the fate of her private burial vault, which was the first of its kind in the cemetery, is an enduring Albany rural mystery. She was the wife of Isaac Hamilton, a lawyer and Albany alderman, and they lived at a fashionable downtown address, 353 Lydia Street, which no longer exists. It was in the South End, near today's Pastures neighborhood. Hamilton was widowed in 1834 when her husband died at age 55, leaving her to raise their son. Her husband was eulogized as a public servant who, quote, evinced a noble disinterestedness of character and elevated views of public duty and public virtue. She outlived him by 13 years. Her funeral procession left the Baptist Church on North Pearl Street on the afternoon of February 6, 1847, included a long line of horse-drawn carriages. She was placed in a private vault, which was the first such burial in the 3 years after Albany Rural was formally consecrated in 1844. The vault was located in Section 5, Lot 23, near the foot of South Bridge Road, just up from the cemetery office. And Hamilton had very specific wishes about her funeral rites. In her will, she wrote that after her remains were locked in the vine-covered vault, quote, the lock should be filled with lead and the keys thrown into the Hudson River. Accounts of her service indicated that this was indeed done. But rumors circulated that a large amount of cash was buried with her. And initial break-in attempts were unsuccessful. But in 1868, more determined grave robbers blew off the lock, broke through a brick wall, but they were unable to breach Hamilton's stone coffin. In addition to the damage caused by the thwarted burglars, the vault was showing signs of structural failure because of shoddy construction. And yet today, it is unclear when her vault was removed, and all that remains is a plain stone marker. Michael, do you have a theory? I've heard different theories that there may have been some kind of family, feud and et cetera, but the story kind of ends with that, and you can read accounts of the vault, and it was a pretty large structure, and there's really nothing there now except for a small stone that says Hamilton. We have that picture in the book, but we were never able to really, and I've never heard anyone that's figured out what happened to her vault. Does anyone know who Edward Cornelius Delavan is?
The hotel?
Yes, Delavan Hotel. Famous hotel near where Union Station is, burned down. I'll talk about that. But Delavan was one of the leading leaders of the temperance movement in America, which was anti-alcohol, anti-drinking. And I'll tell his story. It's quite ironic. And it also figured into there was a major fire there when the hotel burned, and many young women, mainly Irish women who were chambermaids, were killed there. Bill Kennedy used it as a central part in his novel, The Flaming Corsage. Did anyone read that? It talks about the fire of the Delavan house. But I'll read a little bit of this short profile of Edward Delavan. Edward Cornelius Delavan was the owner of the famous downtown hotel and restaurant, the Delavan House, notorious for open bribery and assorted shenanigans of state legislators during the Tammany Hall era. The booze flowed freely at his hotel. He was also a successful wine merchant who later in life did an about-face and became a rabid teetotaler and fanatical leader of the national temperance movement. Delavan was born and raised in Westchester County. His father died when he was 8. He moved to Albany with his mother, 2 sisters, and a brother. Edward became an apprentice in a printer's office at 13. He left to work at his brother's hardware store. The brothers began visiting Europe in 1814 to find more wine sources for their burgeoning wine importing business. Delavan also branched out and began speculating on real estate. He shrewdly bought parcels around the Erie Canal before it was developed, and the land rose sharply in value. He made considerable profit, and in 1829 helped found the Canal Bank of Albany. That same year, he was recruited by the Reverend Nathaniel Hewitt, became an anti-alcohol proselytizer and extremist. Convinced of the evils of liquor, he began spending large sums to back the temperance movement and formed the New York State Temperance Society. He reportedly dumped all the bottles of his valuable wine cellar into the street. He was joined in temperance activities by his friend, Dr. Eliphalet Knott, Presbyterian minister who became president of Union College. Delavan became a longtime Union College trustee and a major donor. He gave Union, for instance, a notable collection of minerals and shells in 1858. Delavan bankrolled temperance newspapers and became a national leader of the cause. He was elected chairman of the American Temperance Union in 1836. He argued against the use of sacramental wine in the church, controversial even among temperance supporters. He traveled to Italy and France and railed against the wine culture from which he had once profited. In 1844, Delavan built his eponymous hotel, widely regarded as the finest hotel and restaurant in the city. It was a 6-story structure on Broadway, across from Union Station at the present-day Tricentennial Park. Luminaries and political hacks gathered there, along with ladies of the night. According to numerous accounts, it was not a dry establishment, although Delavan never publicly discussed that apparent contradiction. During the Civil War, he sent 1 million copies of a temperance tract to soldiers in the Union Army. Delavan was married twice, first to Abby Smith, who died in 1848, and the second time in 1850 to Harriet Ann Schuyler. The couple had 1 child, and they settled in Ballston Spa. In 1860, Delavan's net worth was estimated at $625,000, about $16 million in today's money. Liquor-free towns in Wisconsin and Illinois were named in his honor. Delavan was buried in a family plot, Section 53, Lot 10, halfway up Middle Ridge Road, with a large marble monument topped with a cross. Although Delavan had been dead for 25 years at the time, the Delavan house is remembered most for December 30th, 1894 fire that killed 19 people. It was one of the city's deadliest, and many of the victims were young chambermaids. The fire was fictionalized in William Kennedy's 1996 novel, The Flaming Corsage. So there's Edward Delavan. I could read a few more, but how about some questions? Those of you who've been to Albany Rural Cemetery, what do you think about it, or what are your perspective? Yes.
Well, my question is something you touched on in the beginning. Was you can kind of trace the diseases or epidemics that hit the city over the years. Can you just touch on that lightly?
Again, when you go there, like I said, it's the city of the dead, 135,000 plus people buried there. It's not like you say go to lot 48 and you'll see all the scarlet fever victims. They're sprinkled throughout. So whenever you go there, you have to invest time. And this is like research and sleuthing. So I started with all these experts. Then I went to newspaper accounts and published reference books and things and tried to piece together these stories. But when you're wandering around and you look at the stones, and often what's really interesting too, we have a section in the book, there's a lot of symbolism. Victorians love symbol, like a torch, pointing up would be immortality, etc. But then you'll see some turned down, meaning the life extinguished early and things. And you'll see, other symbols, the thistle for the Scottish and different things. And you'll see grave markers or gravestones with like lambs and things to signify a child died. And you'll look at the dates, and it'll be around the time of yellow fever or something. So that's the way you can see. It's really interesting to look at the dates. What is the life expectancy now? Average, late 70s or something. But there you see a lot of children, a lot of young people. There are a lot of things that could kill you in the last century and the century before. So that's what I mean. You know, you won't go to a certain place. It's interesting, a lot of fraternal organizations would buy a plot and people would be buried there. I'm thinking of the St. Andrew's Society, formed by Scottish immigrants. And I've told a couple stories of interesting people here. Peter Kinnear, Albany Billiard Ball Company. Again, he made a fortune on coming up with the first non-ivory sort of polymer plastic billiard balls manufactured here in Albany, sold, you know, one of the biggest billiard ball company in the world at one point. He was Scottish. He made some money. He helped found the St. Andrew's Society and fund it, and they bought a large plot there. So Scottish immigrants would come, like young men who had no family here, who had no money, were just kind of starting out, and just laborers would die of some disease. Well, they would pay for the funeral expense and bury him in the St. Andrew's plot. And there's other organizations like that. There's firefighters organizations, I think the Masons and others, and they're kind of scattered throughout the cemetery. So that's what I mean. It's nothing that you would just see. There is a whole dedicated area for Civil War soldiers. It's got a beautiful monument with a bronze Lincoln bust on it, and it lists the names of, I believe there's 55 or 60 Civil War veterans buried there, and that's a dedicated plot. It actually gets money from the federal government to maintain it, and there are some other concentrated areas there, but you have to wander. Like I said, 467 acres. It's not as big as Thatcher Park. I think that's 3 times as big, but it's a huge area. It's bigger than the University at Albany campus, bigger than any college campus here. It's bigger than every park, Central Park, Washington Park combined. So it's a large park-like setting with woods and ravines and streams, and there's people buried all around it. And if you spend time, you just kind of encounter, you'll come across a name like Ten Eyck or Lansing or Van Rensselaer. And there are really famous, I've written about Erastus Corning, the mayor, and there's a Corning family plot there. There's a Van Rensselaer plot. There's a Schuyler plot. Some of these central, early Dutch settlers, prominent families in the area have a family plot. And you can kind of do research by looking at the plot, who's buried there, and then go back to other sources and kind of flesh out the story. But it's great fun. Hey, Don.
Is there a rationale to St. Agnes locating to the immediate left?
I should have mentioned that. The interesting thing about Albany Rural Cemetery is it's non-sectarian, non-denominational. What's also great, if you're a dog person, like I am, it's one of the best dog walking sites. Dogs are allowed, which they're not allowed at St. Agnes. They're not allowed at other cemeteries. So burials, like life, is often segregated by religion, by ethnic group, etc. Albany Rural isn't, but St. Agnes is a Catholic cemetery. As far as I know, I believe they check. I mean, you have to be a baptized, recognized member of the Catholic Church to be buried there. And there is a fence between them. They're good neighbors and they get along, but if you were, there are Muslims, Hindus, things buried at Albany Rural. As far as I know, if you try to bury a family member outside the Catholic Church, you wouldn't be buried at St. Agnes. Now, there's an interesting part of the Albany Rural Cemetery up near what they call the church grounds. When they brought all those church burials up from Washington Park, there's a section near there, Temple Beth Emeth. So there's a Jewish cemetery that bought property from Albany Rural, and they're really right in Albany Rural grounds. They have a corner, and they're next to this church grounds. So if you look at the church grounds, I went with Steve Belinsky, who is a retired great historian at the State Museum, started the Albany Colonial History Project, really done some great social history, traced hundreds of people in colonial Albany. And I went there with him because he's really interested in African-American early culture and people in Albany. And the black people are segregated in this group of church burials at Albany Rural. They're sort of off in the corner near the trees. They're not up front where Philip Hooker, the great architect, was brought up here. And he's got one of the nicest, white marble monuments right up front. The black people the graves are all, they're hard to even read now. They're not that well maintained. They're off in the back. But you can find the Episcopal people. You can find the Presbyterian people. You can find the Dutch Reformed Church people. They kind of brought them up in groups and reinterred them that way. But again, St. Agnes is part of the Albany Roman Catholic Diocese. It's primarily, exclusively for Catholics. Albany Rural takes all people regardless of affiliation. And it does have a section where the Temple Beth Emeth buries people of Jewish faith. Yes?
Do you know about the Goldfish Pond by John G. Myers?
Yes. That's another interesting part. Michael is the expert on that. The designer was Douglas, and I'm forgetting his first name. I have to go. David Bates Douglas, who designed Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn and is a notable landscape architect. And he designed this at one point, and Michael took me back to all these kind of lost, forgotten areas. It used to have about 7 beautiful ponds that were accomplished by damming up this river. Over time, they had issues with erosion. Past trustees didn't think it was the thing to do, and they sort of tore out the dams, and those areas are all kind of dry and overgrown. But there's still a main pond left called Cypress Pond right near the Myers Monument, and that's that's a pond. So at the time, people would come, and there were benches around there. Like I said, they'd take the tour, spend all afternoon, bring a picnic lunch. If they had a family plot there, they'd probably bring a trowel and some things and sort of plant some flowers, and that's the other thing you can do there. They'd spend time sitting around the ponds and eating their lunch and thinking about the dead and nature and what have you, something you couldn't do in the middle of the noisy, crowded city. There's still the one pond there. It needs some repair. Part of the issue with we're trying to bring attention to the great resource there is because they have a volunteer board. They're not well financed. They have a perpetual issue of upkeep and maintenance. And the pond needs some work. It used to have a fountain that doesn't work. And there's some other issues where they need more people who are interested to get behind and put some more money into the cemetery, frankly. It's also difficult. This was part of the reason that the next movement after the rural cemetery movement, the rural cemetery movement in the 1840s also spawned the park movement. So Washington Park, Central Park in New York, those reflected and came after these rural cemeteries. And they're very much using the same idea and using architecture, using ponds, using the natural landscape as a way for people to get out of the city and to have some kind of refuge and solitude. So anyway, the newer, if you go to like Memory's Garden or newer cemeteries, they have everything flush so the riding mowers can go right through. It's really difficult to mow and maintain Albany Rural. When you walk it, you'll see it's hilly, it's all knolls and dips and valleys, and you can't just ride big mowers through there. They have to do a lot of hand cutting and using weed whackers and small hand mowers, and it's a challenge. And the people who run it will tell you it's a challenge to hire enough workers and to keep it going and keep it in the black every year. And Michael's a trustee. You can have a discussion with him afterwards if you want. But again, part of this was to bring awareness to this great resource. And while we still have it, and it's not that it's going to go anywhere or fall away, but it needs a little more attention and TLC. Yes.
Do you have information about the Prine family?
A little bit. The Prine house is half a mile from here. That's a good place to start. They were, I knew them through the Cornings. The Prine family was very prominent and wealthy through their lumber company. And one Prine became an ambassador to Japan. They ended up owning the Santanoni Preserve in the Adirondacks, this great camp, which I've been to. And I knew him in association as friends with the Cornings. The Corning family money was in steel and in felt for the paper manufacturing company. It's now called Albany International. It started as Albany Felt. But these were kind of the, industrial titans of Albany at the time, and the Prines were right up there.
It's my understanding that and I don't know his first name. He was one of the founders of the Albany Rural Cemetery. And there's an area in the cemetery that is available only for this particular family.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, families bought their plots. At the time, in the 1840s, you could get a plot for anywhere from $1 to like $100, which would be, you know, equivalent of like 1,000 to 10,000 today, I guess, given inflation. But anyway, families typically bought a plot, and then they could use that whole plot. There could be 5 people buried there. There could be 30 people buried there. Over the generations, it was up to them, you know, to how they wanted to use it within reason. There's a limit to how many you can put on each plot. But again, yeah, the Prines would have their plot. Like I said, the Van Rensselaers had theirs, the Cornings had theirs, the Lansings had theirs. And in addition to ordinary people. I mean, people often ask, they think it's kind of a relic and a historical thing, but it's a working cemetery. They bury, I think, 170, 180 people every year. I think a plot, maybe 200. I think a plot costs about $900, a basic plot now. And it is a business, and they've had a big decline after the Solomon Federal Cemetery in Saratoga. So now veterans and things who get a free burial up there, I think they lost probably 20% of their business when that came in about 15 years ago. But it's a working cemetery, and they're still having, this time of year, they're having burials regularly. And it's a beautiful area. There's still plenty of room to continue to bury people. I mean, they have tens, 100 acres probably at least unused still. Yes?
Is there a master plan of the plots available?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky, and we had to do some digging and things. There's a good general map in this book. There's a good map there when you go to the cemetery office, which is closer to the Broadway side, closer to the Hudson River. That would be the good place to start if you go there. But they have books. See, everything now is digitized. Anyone use Ancestry.com? Some of you studying your own genealogy. If you go on Ancestry.com, which is now a paid service, a paid website, all the records, which is a wall of old 3x5 index cards like the libraries had, like a card catalog, it's all been digitized. So you can search every family, every name on Ancestry.com and see it digitally. But you can also go to the office there, and they will physically pull the card catalogs. And if you say Prine family, there'd probably be a stack of cards this thick, and it would give the dates and all the people buried. Yeah, Michael?
One other thing, partially in conjunction with the Times Union support, we just put up a new website, and we actually have searchable, you can search the entire burial list.
Yeah.
I was able to get that set up. You can't get all the information on the card, but you can get the person's name and date of birth, date of death, and the lot and section numbers. Also, the detailed section maps. There's a whole area on the website with maps, historical maps. I have about 20 historical maps I put up so that you can look at the cemetery at different points in time. So the website is albanyruralcemetery.org, all one word.
So part of this project was to help them upgrade, but Michael, among his many talents, he's a technology expert, and he worked with people on our staff, and it's a much more usable, user-friendly website now than it had been before this. So that would be the best place to start, albanyruralcemetery.org. Yeah. Yes?
There's another website called Find a Grave.
Yeah, that's very good.
Find any cemetery.
That's Find a Grave. That's national.
You put in your person's details.
It's sort of hit and miss for Albany Rural. Again, that's like an open source. It's like Wikipedia. It's whatever people decide to put in there. But it is very helpful. But what Michael's talking about, and what you can get, in physical, if you go to the office and ask for some help, is to look at every card, every burial there. And they also, what I was saying, they have binders, hundreds of pages that outline every single grave in the plots which, you know, for 135,000 plus takes a lot of pages. But you can find, if you're looking for an exact person, you can find it in those books there. Again, it takes a little while. But what's great about when you go over and spend a few hours, you find things you never were looking for. Just unexpected joy of discovery. You make a connection. Oh, yeah, I knew that guy through the Cornings or whatever, and I wonder what happened to him. And then you read the dates, and they might, a lot of these sort of tell little stories on the grave marker too, or have a beautiful piece of scripture or poem or something. So you learn something. It's kind of the difference between buying a book on Amazon and going to a bookstore. I mean, I'm old school. I like books. I like magazines. I like newspapers I can hold and rifle through. I also love this thing. You know, I have the world in my pocket at any moment. I could get on this smartphone and find anything in 10 seconds, but it's not the same. You go into a bookstore, you're looking for one book, and you found five other things. So you go to the cemetery, you think you're going to spend an hour, you'll spend 3 hours and find 10 things you weren't looking for. You know, it's that joy of serendipity and discovery. Yes?
Paul, what was the major source of the biographies that you have in here?
I mean, a million things. First, going out, walking around with these experts for many, many hours. There's great resource books like Joel Munsell. He's mentioned in here, The Annals of Albany. You know, things like William Kennedy's O Albany, Jack McEnany's book on Albany, our own clip file. There's a list of sources in the back, I mean, dozens. You find little pieces, kind of like a puzzle, from 10 sources, and then it's up to me to read it, absorb it, and then write these little individual portraits. But there's little snippets all over the place. No one source has everything. Yes?
Historically and over time, what was the conditions or entitlements for a person to be buried there?
It was really private, non-sectarian, so there were no conditions if you could afford to buy a plot. And I'll read a section. You know, it's not all for profit, and, you know, they went out of their way to do a lot of things for less fortunate people. And it's not just all titans of industry buried there. Let me read you this section on the Albany Almshouse, because I wrote this story before they got reinterred here too, so I knew a little bit about this. The Albany County Almshouse Cemetery. It's up near the church grounds and near the Temple Beth Emma section. The Albany County Almshouse plot contains the full and partial remains of 1,125 people whose only crime was being poor. They lived in misery, died without dignity, and were buried in a potter's field off New Scotland Avenue in Albany. Coffins stacked 5 or 6 deep in unmarked mass graves during the turn of the 20th century. They were exhumed, removed, and reinterred in Albany Rural Cemetery in 2002 at a cost of $2.4 million to make way for construction of a $60 million biomedical research facility on the University Heights campus behind the David Axelrod Institute of Public Health. Those nameless souls were considered the human detritus of the industrial age. Their ranks included amputees unable to work in factories, indigent single mothers with children they couldn't feed, the old and poor debilitated by disease, homeless, illiterate immigrants, the mentally ill, and alcoholics. At the almshouse, forced to do farm labor, men in their 40s died of exhaustion. Young women succumbed to cancer and consumption. Babies were stillborn or died from starvation and cholera. It was a grim place. Researchers found that many men had fractured hand bones, injuries consistent with fistfights. Skulls showed broken noses or heads bashed in, legs fractured, ribs shattered. Their research reveals a Dickensian underside of Albany history. Dutch colonists created the almshouse in the 17th century as a warehouse for the marginalized and damaged. After several moves, the almshouse was located on New Scotland Avenue from 1880 until it closed in 1928. Experts in the field of human osteology, the study of bones, are attempting to reclaim the histories of these unfortunate paupers. Although records and maps are spotty, it is nearly impossible to match bones with names in century-old almshouse registers. It is unclear if the remains of Mary Baker were dug up and reinterred. Her situation was not uncommon. She emigrated in February 1871 from a farm in County Clare, Ireland, and too sick to support herself, ended up in the almshouse. She died 10 months later of consumption. She was 45. The almshouse cemetery was a catch-all for the indigent, including unidentified corpses found in the Hudson River, penitentiary inmates, street vagrants, and new immigrants with no relatives. Very few were buried with valuables. During exhumation, a total of 4 rings, a half-dozen smoking pipes, and a couple of rosaries were found. In 2002, they were reburied in individual caskets and vaults on a windswept 1-acre meadow on Section 48 near the intersection of Linden Avenue and Middle Ridge Road. Marginalized and anonymous in life, their final resting place is alongside Albany's ruling Dutch elite. A 5-foot gray granite monument reads, "Here lie those once buried in the Albany County Almshouse Cemetery." And there's a stanza from a Walt Whitman poem. "Let me glide noiselessly forth, with the key of softness, unlock the locks with a whisper. Set ope the doors, O soul." The other side bears a Latin phrase, "Requiescat in pace," rest in peace. So there's stories there that are very sad and moving, but again, the people at Albany Rural Cemetery, made way for that. I think it's somewhat ironic that they moved these people to make a $60 million public health biomedical research facility. But again, it gets back to what spurred the creation of this grand, beautiful park-like cemetery in 1841. It was the way people like that were treated, and it was kind of collective shame among the community saying, we can do better, we must do better, we should do better for our people. And they wanted a place that they could be proud of that was beautiful and epic and inspiring, and that's what they got at Albany Rural. I mean, there's so many interesting. Marcus T. Reynolds, I think the greatest architect of Albany, did the D&H building, now SUNY Central, did some of the other beautiful buildings around Albany. I mean, he's buried there with his brother, Kyler Reynolds, who was a great historian and writer at his family plot. But he also designed many of the beautiful, large-scale monuments. So when you go through there, you really get a sense of great art and great architecture. The Angel of the Sepulchre is one of the most visited, next to Chester Alan Arthur's grave, one of the most visited places of the cemetery. A sculpture by Erastus Dow Palmer, a great nationally recognized from Albany sculptor. And it's just a beautiful, there's a model of it at Albany Institute of History and Art if you want to see it. But this has been, again, kind of weathered. It could use a restoration. I know the cemetery would like to do that, but they need some donors and supporters and people to help them out. But at one point, I found in doing research and going to the Albany Institute and looking at a lot of the records, there were tens of thousands of postcards printed of the Angel of the Sepulchre. People traveled from around the country to go to Albany Rural Cemetery and to look at that sculpture because it was considered one of the great sculptures in the world and the country at that time. And it's there at Albany Rural. Again, it's got some lichen growing on it. It's kind of lost some of its sharp edges. It should be preserved and restored, but it's still there. And I think it's important that we recognize and sort of realize this gem that we have before it's too tarnished. Yes?
Do you know any the orphanages? Because I know my grandmother's sister died in an orphanage.
Right.
And they weren't very wealthy. They were poor. Did they bury any orphans in Albany Rural, sir?
Not that I know. That's the only large-scale, burial of indigent people. The orphanages, some of them in Albany, had some cemeteries attached, and I don't know where they got moved to. There's Parsons in Albany, which has been merged a couple times, started as the Albany Orphan Asylum, and there's some others, but I don't know. There's no specifically dedicated plot. But again, you could either go online to the cemetery website or go to the cemetery and look through the catalogs and search a name, a family name if you have one, and see if they're buried there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes?
There are Tiffany windows in the
Tiffany windows are at Oakwood Cemetery in Troy, which is another beautiful cemetery. But there are a couple Marcus Reynolds buildings at Albany Rural Cemetery. They have a crematorium and a chapel there, which is a beautiful building. The office is a beautiful building. And again, throughout, there's like the one pond remaining, but there's some large-scale monuments and markers throughout that are stunning, that are world-class. Yes?
I think Albany Rural has Friends of Albany Rural
Yes.
organization, and they send out a newsletter with some of these stories.
Right. They had been doing that. I think that stopped. It's in hiatus for a while. Michael, you're continuing it?
Continuing. I'm the editor, but we publish a newsletter for the Friends about 3 times a year.
Right. See, for a long time, Norman Rice, who's now approaching 90, was supporting that. Peter Hess. Part of the issue with a lot of organizations, the aging, and people can't produce and carry the load like they used to. So I'm sure Michael would love to hear from anyone that wants to get involved and help him out.
If you're interested, the website, there's a place to express interest, and we can follow up, and there's some information about the Friends group as well on the website.
And that helps support the cemetery, right?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And this book, they're selling copies, and all their proceeds are helping the cemetery. Any proceeds, I don't get a penny from this. The Times Union doesn't, goes to the Times Union Hope Fund. So this is strictly, a fundraising venture, this book. Yes?
The cemetery is owned by the city of Albany, is it not?
No, it's owned by a group of trustees that drew up, in 1841, bylaws and a constitution, essentially. But it's not owned by the city of Albany. It's outside the city of Albany. It's actually in Menands. So the city of Albany has nothing to do with it. It's privately owned and privately run. That's part of the reason why they have to work hard to maintain it financially. It doesn't get government support. Yes?
Just an observation that it supplies the town of Colonie with a great green space,
right,
and a nature sanctuary. It's a great aviary.
Yeah, it really is a lot of. That's the interesting thing. We're sort of hoping this project, everything is cyclical in history, I believe. You see the same trends, in 2014 that you saw in 1914. Do you read the little item we have in our paper every day, on this date, a century ago? So we have 1914, then on this date, 1964, 50 years ago, and then like 1989, 25 years ago. And it's really interesting that things just cycle through. And part of it, there's no reason that this can't be a great destination for an afternoon or a day trip, and people are doing that. Dog walkers, joggers, bikers, bird watchers, people who love trees, animal watchers, go over to the cemetery and enjoy this basically a great park in, near Loudonville, near Menands, very close to the downtown city, and enjoy it for those reasons. And again, you can do some historical sleuthing. You can do your genealogy there if you're interested in architecture and art. There's a lot of ways you can enjoy the cemetery, but its natural beauty is really the key to it all. That's why it was built, and that's the whole point of the rural cemetery movement. Yes?
There's the caretaker's cottage right at the beginning there.
Yeah. So there's 2 entrances. That one on 378 near Van Rensselaer Boulevard, that's one entrance, and that's a caretaker's cottage. But the main entrance where the train used to stop and where these carriage rides began, and sort of the grand Marcus Reynolds entrance, is on Broadway down in Menands. If you go to the bottom of the 378 hill, take a left, and come in that way. And the cemetery, or the office, is down that way, and you'll pass the entrance to St. Agnes on that end towards the river. But there is the entrance, the south gate at 378 and Van Rensselaer Boulevard, and you'll see a caretaker's cottage there. Any other questions? I'll stick around for a little bit if you'd like. You've been really great. I appreciate it, and get out and enjoy the cemetery whenever you can. Thanks a lot.